This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. I'm Sophie Ikenye. Today we look at the critical issue of debt on the continent. Plus, why do the US midterm elections matter to Africans?
I am Peter Okwoche, live at the Overseas Development Institute Summit, looking at Africa's rising debt. Just over a decade after most of the continent's debt was written off, is Africa facing another debt crisis?
I am Masi Juma, and I'm in the USA where the midterm elections are underway. I will be looking at some of the most important issues on the vote.
And I'm Mimi Fawaz. I'll have a roundup of all the top sports stories, including in athletics. Kenya's Mary Ketani makes a superb comeback to win her 4th New York City Marathon.
Well, thanks for joining us on Focus on Africa from BBC World News. We start the program with the growing concerns about Africa's rising debt. It's a subject of a major conference this week here in London. We'll be looking at what it means for Africa and what it means for you. Despite billions being written off just over a decade ago, what is the scale of government borrowings across the continent now? We start with this from Waihiga Mwaura.
Sub-Saharan Africa is falling further and further into debt. 40% of the region's countries are now at high risk of debt distress and are struggling to service their debts. There are concerns that refinancing that debt could also become more costly. So why does Africa have so much debt? Well, lending to Africa surged after the financial crisis, where the high yields of Africa's government bonds attracted fund managers and foreign investors. Borrowing makes sense for many African countries. It helps to finance roads, schools and hospitals. But keeping that money in Africa remains a problem. And it's thought that as much as 60 cents in every dollar borrowed leaves the continent within 5 years. In the end, it's citizens that are left with the bill. As the number of countries unable to service their debts grows, officials at the International Monetary Fund are urging African countries to raise taxes. And with tax revenue being used to service debt, that could mean poorer services in parts of Africa.
Wahiga Mwaura there. Let's go to Peter Okwoche now, who is at the Africa's Rising Debt Conference taking place today and tomorrow at the Overseas Development Institute here in London. Peter.
Well, many thanks, Sophie. And economists and analysts have been looking at the issue of Africa's rising debt profile. Just how serious is it? To discuss that and more, I'm joined by Dr. Antoinette Saye. She's a former Liberian finance minister and now a visiting fellow at the Center for Global Development in Washington. Thanks for joining us. When you joined the Liberian government, the country's debt was 600% of the GDP. Did you ever think we'd go back to those days?
We did have arrears, that's sizable, 600% of GDP, and needed to clear them fairly quickly before accessing any financing for our exit from fragility. And Liberia is certainly not back at that level, but there's certainly a risk that it could move from moderate risk of debt distress, which it is now, into high risk if good decisions are not taken about managing the debt.
And what about across the rest of the continent? Just how serious is the rising debt issue? Is it a crisis?
It doesn't have to be a crisis. That's the bottom line. There are things countries can do and partners can do as well. A number of countries hit by the massive fuel shock borrowed to be able to manage that shock. Countries also that are fragile and had been hit by other shocks, pandemics, also suffered and became more distressed from debt. And countries that took advantage of the low interest rates brought about by unconventional monetary policies in advanced countries, borrowed to finance their infrastructure needs. Now, countries can do better on their own domestic resource mobilization. Not all countries that are at high risk of debt distress need be in debt distress. They can avert that. by better choosing investments to spend their borrowings on, so maximizing the limited space they have to borrow. By doing more on their domestic revenue mobilization side, the international community needs to do better. New lenders on more transparent lending, more due diligence, and I'm not just talking about China. Let's remember that Mozambique was not China.
I need to come in here, Doctor. I mean, do you think, very briefly, do you think lessons have been learned from the past?
I think countries have indeed learned lessons from the past, and it's important to say it's not all countries in sub-Saharan Africa that are heading to debt distress. We have countries that have borrowed sensibly, a country like Rwanda that borrowed quite a bit but is at low risk of debt distress, is growing very robustly.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, just very recently, Kenya announced that it was putting up 26 of its state-owned companies for privatization in a bid to shore up the country's economy. Now, one project that has been heavily criticized in that country is the new rail line project. It's helped increase the levels of Kenya's debt, and even just a few months after it was commissioned, it's cost the country $100 million. The BBC's Zawadi Modibo has this report from Nairobi.
The Chinese-built standard gauge railway connects the port city of Mombasa with the Kenyan capital Nairobi. The 470-kilometer line replaced the old meter gauge railway built by the British in 1902 and nicknamed the Lunatic Express. While most Kenyans agree that the country needs modern infrastructure, critics argue the $3.2 billion price tag was not economically prudent.
It is not viable. It cannot compete price-wise without a subsidy. And the question becomes, why would you put so much public money in a project that requires a subsidy for something that was not being subsidized before?
The Kenya government is expected to soon start repaying the facility from the China Exim Bank at an average $300 million a year. The government has said it expects the train line to boost Kenya's economy, hoping for an increase of 1.5% GDP. At $50 billion, Kenya's public debt is more than half the value of its economic output. It ranks at position 14 in Africa using the debt to GDP ratio, according to the World Economic Forum. And just last month, the IMF urged Kenya to refinance debt using concessional loans to lengthen maturities in the coming year and limit commercial credit for projects with high social and economic returns. This means that Kenya has cut public spending and raised taxes. These passengers may be enjoying the new fast-speed railway, but they have doubts as to whether it is worth the final bill they will be left with.
The ordinary Kenyan is suffering because we keep paying more and more for services that are not up to par for what we are paying for.
This is undoubtedly a flaring symbol of progress, but the big question remains, will it attract the volumes of business it must to prove it was worth the cost? Zawadi Mdibo, BBC, Nairobi.
Well, let's look at the sustainability of these debts on the continent. I'm now joined by Fanuel Bokosi. He's the Executive Director for the civil society group AfroDebt. Fanuel, just how sustainable is Africa's debt at the moment?
The Africa's debt is sustainable, but it's threatened that it might be unsustainable in a few years' time. If you look at the estimates of 2009, only 9 countries were in the risk group of debt and sustainability, but by 2016 that number has moved up to 16, and by 2018 there are 17 countries in sub-Saharan Africa who are at high risk of debt distress and are already in debt distress.
And we hear about these huge amounts that are borrowed by African governments, but just how does it trickle down to the ordinary African on the streets of Lome or Nairobi or Kinshasa?
or Lilongwe, where I come from. The point is that if those dates are used properly, then they can spur economic growth and then they can spur development. However, if those dates are not used properly, it means that the countries will have repayment dates. And if they have repayment dates, three things are going to happen. One, there will be cuts in social services. Three, development will be threatened. And then four, tax has to rise in order to make those repayments.
And Fanuel, I mean, how do we hold governments to account to make sure that they don't go on borrowing these, what I've heard a lot of people describe at this summit as irresponsible loans, just because they know that they will not be there in seat to pay them back?
They need to be accountable first by understanding that leaders do not borrow for their own sake, they borrow on behalf of the people. So the role of Parliament, who are the representatives of the people, is extremely important. And another thing that we need to do as technical experts is to begin to demystify the technical language of debt and make people understand. So the key word is transparency, information, data availability, and explaining all these things in the language that every ordinary person in the village can understand. Because this debt is not taken by the leaders, it is the debt that us, our children, our grandchildren are going to pay for it.
Fanuel Bokosi, thank you very much for being on Focus on Africa. Well, Sophie, this summit continues tomorrow, and Focus on Africa will be back here to see how we can resolve this issue of Africa over borrowing. Back to you in the studio, Sophie.
All right, Peter Okoche there. Of course, you're our ears there at that conference. This is Focus on Africa from BBC World News. After the break, we are in Minnesota, where a Somali immigrant and single mother is running for the state's House of Representatives. Welcome back to Focus on Africa. Americans go to the polls on Tuesday to vote in midterm elections. Now, the poll will define which party holds the balance of power in both houses of Congress, and the outcome will help define the rest of Donald Trump's presidencies. Now, voters also choose governors and members of state legislatures. And Mercy Juma reports now from Minneapolis, where she has been talking to Somali women who are leading the way in politics, in business, and are even running for office in Tuesday's elections.
American women are running for office in record-breaking numbers. Among them are women from minority groups like the Somali immigrants. In Minnesota, 5 out of the 9 candidates running for various posts are Somali women. Hodan Hassan is one of them. She is a Democratic candidate running for House of Representatives in Minnesota's District 62A.
This fight is not even about me anymore. It's about other young women, Muslim young women, African young women, that there is a limitless possibilities for them, that they can do whatever it is that they dare to dream.
Hodan follows in the footsteps of Ilhan Omar, who is continuing to break new ground. If elected, Omar is said to become the first Somali American to be elected to Congress. The desire to be better represented is being echoed by women outside the political spectrum too.
We all need each other to make our country great.
Somali women are building empires. They are their family's breadwinners. Amalina is one of them. She owns a salon.
Our president is good with numbers and economy, and we should give him credit for that. But if he was a little bit nicer, would have mean a lot. If he just says kind words to us.
A sentiment which resonates with many women across the U.S.
These midterms are largely being seen as a referendum on Trump. Local media reports that for most voters, the presidency determines who they pick on the ballot. Now, at the end of the day, the party that controls Congress will make the president's life a breeze or a nightmare during the last 2 years of his term.
The midterms have long attracted fewer voters than elections in presidential years, with minorities and young people among those most likely to stay home. But this year, research shows voter registration rose sharply.
Absolutely. My whole family registered. So everybody's registered. My mom, my sisters, everyone is registered. So.
But in Minnesota, there is a sense of unease, especially among business owners like Fatma.
Politicians come to this mall to, rally or to talk to the shop owners. But when they talk to them, they need to realize what the needs of this community is.
With early voting figures showing an increase in turnout compared to the last midterm election in 2014, it's clear the heated political landscape is galvanizing people to make their voices heard. Mercy Juma, BBC News, Minnesota, USA.
And Mercy is, of course, on the ground watching developments for us. She joins us from Minneapolis. Mercy.
Thank you, Sophie. Indeed, many issues are at the center of this election, from immigration to healthcare, the economy, and faith and racism, especially in Minnesota, where we are. It is home to about 100,000 Somali Americans, and they say there has been a heightened sense of Islamophobia and racism, especially since 2016. I have been talking to some of them, and they have shared their experiences with me.
Religion is an important part of their lives. Every day, members of the Dar al-Farouk Mosque converge for prayers despite a heightened fear of attacks of places of worship. A year ago, a homemade bomb was thrown inside the mosque during morning prayers. It landed in the imam's office, causing extensive damage.
People are very paranoid. They become paranoid. They become like feeling like, you know, who's gonna kill us? Or I mean, it became like a war zone. I mean, someone would feel like we are not safe going to the mosque.
In recent weeks, other places of worship have also been targeted. A shooting in a Pittsburgh synagogue in October left 11 people dead.
Places of worship are traditionally looked at as a safe haven, a sanctuary. They are a symbol of peace. But now for many worshippers, there is fear and anxiety every time they come to make their prayers, with many wondering if they will be the target of the next attack.
I was in a friend's dorm. We were catching the news, and I had a fellow friend who's white. And we saw it was the situation when ISIS was kind of on the rise, and he asked me, he looked me in the eye, and he said, "Can you tell them to cut it off, call them on speed dial?"
As someone that was actually born in America and has been raised in America and considered themselves Minnesotan, it's really heartbreaking to see that my fellow Minnesotan thinks that I'm a terrorist.
A lady came to me at my job and grabbed my scarf and said, "You're in America now, you can take that off."
This community feels that President Trump's remarks on Muslims is fueling anti-Islam sentiments. Asma was struck in the face with a beer glass in a restaurant whilst she was speaking Swahili.
When Trump, he was running for president, when he came here, he attacked Muslims and he attacked Somalis. So did we know that things were going to happen? Yes, but did I ever think it was going to happen to me? No, but then it was Islamophobia, and it was the ideology that people nowadays have in America, that if you don't speak like them, if you don't look like them, if you speak another language, you're not American.
Amidst all the hate crimes, this community still shows resilience and strength in the hope of a united country.
Now, these communities hope that the people who they will vote for tomorrow, the 6th, will solve some of these problems. And to further discuss this issue, I am joined by Fartun Weli. She is the executive director of Isturun, a non-profit organization that gives Somali women support and tools to thrive. Thank you for joining us, Fartun.
Thank you for having us. Welcome to Minnesota.
Thank you so much. Are people coming out to vote?
Oh, yes, they are. Minnesota has large African diaspora community, including my Somali community. We have a Liberian community here. We have a Nigerian community, Kenyan professional workers, all kinds of different African communities. So we're coming out. Also, there's huge organizing that's happening in African American community that, as you know, had been a lot under pressure and oppression. Native women and Native communities also coming out in a number of records that we have never seen. So it's do or die, that's as they say.
Very well. And what are some of the most important issues in this vote, especially for the African community?
The African community, let me first say, we are being looked at as a deficit-based approach. approach. People think we're just taking things, but let me give you a few examples. Somali community, we're only here between 20 to 25 years. We have over 650 small businesses that led by half of it by women. We're bringing $87 million a year into the tax, into the state. We're a very small community. If you look at the Liberian community, the highest healthcare workers, if Liberian community and Kenyan nurses quit today in Minnesota and say we're not going to go to work, our healthcare in the state is going to collapse. Talk about all the incredible opportunities that we're bringing into the state. So we're playing a critical role, but what the rhetoric has been doing is making us less visible, or I would say invisible. And so voting matters because the healthcare and health insurance are very critical for refugees, new immigrants like the community that I'm from. Jobs are very critical, and also economic vitality of our community is important because, as you know, it's not only for us that we're here, we're also being waiting by back home. And the other thing I would say is our communities are very young, so below 30, education is important, jobs are important, and economic vitality for our community as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fartun. Really appreciate it. Now, Sophie, we will be in Minnesota. We will be following up the U.S. elections. And tomorrow is the big day. Definitely we will keep you up to speed with what is happening. And we'll be on Focus on Africa in the evening to tell you more about what is going on and what the results are. Back to you, Sophie.
Masi Juma there for us in Minneapolis. Of course, you are our eyes and ears there on the ground. Let's now find out what's happening in the world of sport. Mimi.
Thank you very much, Sophie. We start in athletics. African athletes picked up the top prizes at the New York City Marathon on Sunday. Ethiopia's Lelisa Desisa took the men's title. Desisa, who has won the Boston Marathon twice, finished ahead of defending champion Jeffrey Kamworor. And as well in the women's race, Kenya's Mary Ketani won it for 4th time. Ketani, who was second last year after 3 New York victories, made an impressive comeback to the top again. Kenya's Vivian Chariot finished second.
But I wanted actually to run a very nice race. And when I just course alone, I was not thinking of course about, but I was saying, okay, let me just try to win. Because sometimes back, I remember very well, I went in front and they got me at 24 miles. So for today, I was thinking of to try to win.
Love that, just about enjoying the race. Now it's an important game for the bottom of the table as Huddersfield take on Fulham at home. Steve Mounier who's right there, is under pressure to get those goals. Huddersfield, who sit at the bottom, haven't won a single match in their last 6 Premier League encounters. Fulham have made their worst ever start after 10 matches of a top-flight season. Ivory Coast Jean-Michael Seri will be hoping that Fulham can pick things up. Guinea's Naby Keita is back in the Liverpool squad ahead of the Champions League match trip in Serbia to Red Star Belgrade. Keita had been out with a hamstring injury, which he picked up last month whilst on international duty with Guinea. But he's now recovered and has been included in Liverpool's 21-man travelling squad, along with Senegal's Sadio Mane and Egypt's Mohamed Salah. And we're going to stay with that Liverpool theme. Remember the Cristiano Ronaldo bust? Well, there is now the Mohamed Salah statue, and it's been drawing some mixed reactions. The sculpture of the Liverpool and Egypt football star was unveiled in his home country, with many on social media not too convinced with its resemblance. And what do you make of it? Can you see it right over there? The artwork was put on display on Sunday at the World Youth Forum in Sharm el Sheikh, and that's the Cristiano Ronaldo one as well. That got a lot of people talking. I will leave you at home to make up your mind. That's all the sport. What do you make of that, Sophie?
No comment. Don't take me there. No comment. Thank you for the sport. Thanks, Mimi. Thank you. Well, to end the program, I will leave you with some pictures from Ghana of Prince Charles and the Duchess of Cornwall. Today, the Prince acknowledged Britain's role in the slave trade, describing it as an appalling atrocity that had left an indelible stain on the history of our world. Now, Ghana served as a major hub where African slaves were held before being shipped away. Earlier, the prince reignited the long-standing relationship between the British and the Asante people with a historic visit to the Asante Hene, or Tumfo Osei Tutu II in Kumasi.